going to ask you to sit here.
And we'll
We have the seat.
Welcome back from lunch. If you could take your seats, we'd love to get started. I'd like to welcome you back from lunch. I'm Pat Zigarmi. I'm a co-founder of the Ken Blanchard companies, and I've been helping with the CPL coordinate this event. I'd also like to introduce Andy Zelleke. Andy is a co-director of the Center for Public Leadership here at Harvard University and a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School. So we're both delighted to have you here. We're really going to start the conversation, get you talking with each other. We've heard the sobering list of challenges, tasks, strategy issues facing this president. We've begun to talk about character. We've begun to talk about competency, talent, skill set we need. We've spilled over into roles of educator, energizer. We've talked about the role of mobilizer, of initiative. We've begun to hint at the power of technology to build consensus. The goal of this conversation is to really say, if we could interview the candidates post the conventions, if we could interview them about what's in their heart, what is their emotional and intellectual intelligence to handle this list of tasks. That's what we're about this afternoon. We're about creating the interview questions. So we've asked 5 accomplished experts to really weigh in. If I could interview about leadership, what would the questions I would pose to these would-be candidates? And we have a diverse audience and therefore a diverse set of questions. And what's going to be fun is you're going to get to weigh in on which of those questions are most interesting, which of those questions are most provocative, which of those questions will get us insight into the leadership capacity, the character, the courage of the candidates for the President of the United States. After each presentation, you're going to be asked to rate the questions that each panelist posed. You're going to be able to weigh in and to say, you know, that's an interesting question. I would like someone in the media to be posing that question. I would like to hear the answer to that question, because that would give me tremendous insight into how this person will govern. You'll also get a compilation this afternoon of all of the results of the team discussions that will follow this panel. So after this 1-hour panel, you're going to be spending nearly an hour at your table reaching consensus about the top 15 questions. What is it that we really want to pose to the candidates? And you'll have input from the panelists. You'll have input from the pulse of the room. And you'll have your own creativity and sensitivity to what is it that the public would love to see asked of these candidates. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit more directions about the touchpad technology, but if you can have that handy, that would be helpful. It might also be good for you to dig into the blue packet here. I'm going to use that as a sample. And to find this colorful set of questions. These questions are the questions that the panelists sent us ahead of time. And we've asked them to do a little bit of color commentary on their questions. Why are these the best questions? And you're going to get a chance to weigh in. So you're going to hear our first panelist talk about the questions that are on the first sheet, the bright green sheet. So let me turn to Andy right now, and we'll just jump right into it.
Well, let me thank all the panelists for their hard work in reflecting on their own leadership experiences and in generating these questions. We appreciate it very deeply. We've got 5 panelists here and limited time, so I'm going to ask that everybody limit their comments to 6 to 8 minutes so we can preserve some time for Q&A with the audience. Let's start with Andy Card. Andy is, of course, a distinguished public servant, and we're proud to say a graduate of the Kennedy School. He served for more than 5 years as White House Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. He was the second longest serving Chief of Staff in history. This was obviously a period of great challenge for the United States, with the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happening only 8 months into the new administration. Andy previously served in George Bush 41's administration as Secretary of Transportation, and has also had leadership roles in the private sector in the automobile industry. Andy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Andy. A correction of the record. I did not graduate from the Kennedy School of Government. I actually quit. And that was to help create a climate where George Herbert Walker Bush could end up being vice president and then president. So I love the Kennedy School. I love the way you stimulate theory and invite different practices. And I would like to comment about your theory and the practices if I can. I very much enjoyed the discussions this morning, but I did find them a little bit more theoretical than practical. And I also take a look at the candidates who are accepting the invitation to be President of the United States. And by the way, our Constitution is nothing more than an invitation. We're one of the few democracies in the world that doesn't obligate us to do anything in terms of a relationship with our government. We're just invited to have a relationship with it. It is our government, and we're represented by people who serve in Congress and serve in the Senate. Article 2 says that there will be a president, and Article 3 says there will be justices who put on robes, and we never know their names, and we don't know how they make their decisions. But in terms of celebrating the democracy, we're just invited to show up. And some people accept the invitation, and some people choose not to, but we all talk about it. And the First Amendment to the Constitution gives us the right to gather, to complain, to petition, and maybe make a difference. But it's really Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 that give us the government. And there's no obligation except the invitation to recognize that we can run for office, we can show up and vote, and I wish more of you would accept the invitation to run for office, and I certainly would encourage all of you to accept the invitation to vote. And it's amazing how few people accept either invitation, especially in Massachusetts if you're a Republican. And I am a Republican from Massachusetts, and I did accept the invitation, and it was rejected on more than one occasion. I also find that the candidates who seek office always try to be love magnets. They want you to love them. And so they are with you. They share your pain. They will stay in your living room. They want you to join with them. But my experience is that presidents seldom have the luxury of trying to be, with any success, love magnets. Instead, they have to make very tough decisions. And the tough decisions are usually not the ones we can anticipate. They may center around issues that we anticipate. But the decisions themselves, the tough decisions, are usually subsets of the bigger decisions that we've debated, or in fact, they are decisions that they never thought they would be invited to answer. And so I have found that the greatest attribute that a president needs after having good ethics, and I think something to lean on like faith, they have to demonstrate the courage to be lonely. The courage to understand that they may be making a decision that no one will understand, no one will like, and few will respect. But it's the right decision, and therefore they have to make it. And so when I look for a candidate to lead us, I would say, which one of them has the courage to offend me deeply, to cause me to argue against them, but to do that which they believe is right, knowing that the decisions are always tough. And in fact, if a president is making an easy decision, the chief of staff has not done his or her job, because easy decisions can be made by other people in government. Only the toughest decisions are made by the president, and any tough decision must be a decision where there is some kind of preparation. And time doesn't always allow you to have as much preparation as you would like, because the decisions come very quickly. And it could be on issues that you easily anticipate, like tax policy. The current president took office. He promised to cut everyone's taxes. He was going to cut everyone's taxes. And that was a pretty easy principle to say. We want to cut everybody's taxes. What do the tax cuts look like? Those are the tough decisions, especially when a senator says, I will not sign the conference committee report unless this language is in the bill. That's a tough decision. And it may not fit with the overall principle that the president had when he took office. Obviously, there are lots of other tough decisions that a president has to make, including ones that are exclusive to the president. And Article 2 does give exclusive decisions to the president. In fact, the oath of office, which is the real job description for a president, doesn't even mention the issues that we argue about all the time. It doesn't mention taxes or healthcare policy or domestic policy or economic policy. It just says preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And there is no conditional clause to it. It doesn't say if the winds are all blowing in the right direction, or if everyone agrees. It doesn't say if the UN gives you permission. It doesn't even say if the French are on board. You just have to make the tough decision. And it also does not present a timeline under which the decision must be made, except it's kind of like the porridge for the three bears. You want it to be just right. And the decision can't come too early, or it may not be the right decision. If it comes too late, it's irrelevant. So you're always hoping that the tough decision comes at the right time and that it is the right decision. And the reason it is the right decision is because you can never make it with an expectation that you're making the wrong decision. You make a decision with an expectation that it is a tough decision, you're making the right one, and you hope that the implementation will be consistent with your expectation. So I would say the courage to be lonely is the most important attribute to have if you're going to be the President of the United States, and every president will have to face lonely, courageous decisions. With regard to the easiest thing to do in the White House is actually to participate in a policy debate, because presidents attract the best and the brightest, and they always should. And a healthy number of them will come from institutions like Harvard and the Kennedy School. But almost every one of them will be a type A personality, and therefore, every time that they show up, they won't even have the courage to admit that they agree with anybody else. So it's not a danger that the president is going to be giving monolithic counsel. The president will always get counsel that represents lots of different views and will be challenged. So I actually think the easiest part of the job is actually the job that centers around the policy debates that you relish so much and look forward to having in your classrooms or in your everyday life. But the president finds it very easy to stimulate lots of policy debate. It is very difficult to make the decisions around that debate. The 1 minute sign went up, and I'd be glad to come back with more commentary later on. Thank you.
Excellent. So you had a chance to hear Andy talk about a couple of the questions on his list. You have the other ones posted, and you have them in front of you. So I'd like you to take out your touchpad, and you simply need to add 3 numbers, using the numbers 1 through 8. Add 3 numbers of the questions that you would love posed to the candidates. Which of these questions would teach us about their character, about their courage, about their skill set? So if you can take a moment and add 3 numbers to your touchpad, that would be helpful. I'm going to give you a bit of a time here to do this since it's the first time we've done it. Excellent. Only about a half of the room has voted at this point, so let's see if you can all get your answers in. And when you have submitted 3, you'll see a sign that says valid. That indicates your vote's been recorded. Let's just take another 10 seconds. Excellent. So we'll close the poll right now. So what did people say? You were persuasive, Andy. They said that the courage to be lonely is one of the most important questions we need to pose, and we need to get at their comfort with that. They also said that 3, the hardest decisions won't be consensus decisions. What will inform your decision making? And it looks like the next one, there's a couple of ties down there, is 5. The role requires decisiveness. Share some examples of your ability to be decisive. And then the last question is that transition occurs. You're not going to get the help you need as soon. How will you work in a bipartisan way to kind of accelerate that process where you can actually mobilize the energy of the government quickly? I want to remind the scribes that are at the table and the facilitators that are at the table, you might just want to jot down which of those, at least the pulse of this group, said, are important questions to ask. So there's a scribe at each one of your tables, and there's also a facilitator. If at least someone at each of the tables can gather that information, you'll have another input when you begin to sort through all of these questions. Andy?
Cheryl Dorsey is our next panelist. Cheryl is a Kennedy School graduate. You did finish, didn't you, Cheryl? You did. Very good. Okay. She's one of America's most distinguished leaders in the young field of social entrepreneurship, which is increasingly capturing the imagination of large numbers of our country's most talented and idealistic young people through organizations like Teach for America and City Year, both of which got early support from Echoing Green. For the past 5 years, Cheryl has led Echoing Green, a global nonprofit that has empowered and funded with more than $25 million in startup capital almost 500 social entrepreneurs around the world. Cheryl's questions should be coming up on the screen while she's speaking for you to read them as she goes, and you'll also have them in your handout on the light blue sheet. Cheryl.
Thanks, Andy, and I just want to thank the Center for Public Leadership for this terrific day, as well as the Ken Blanchard companies. I'm so thrilled to be back here. Any opportunity to get back to the Kennedy School is a welcome one. I can say that the day is already a stunning success because Andy and Steve have alerted me to the best pizza in Massachusetts, so I might make a beeline out of here after the reception and head to the Linwood Cafe, so thank you for that very important piece of information. In my, I guess, 5 minutes with you all, I was a little bit worried that my remarks would be theoretical, which could be conflated with completely useless, given that this is not my purview, this is not my area of expertise. But I have to say, in looking at your questions, Andy, as well as the responses, I think I'm in about the right ballpark, which gives me some confidence to maybe share with you the framework I use to arrive at the questions that I pose for this part of the day. As Andy mentioned, I live and work in the world of social entrepreneurship, which is a fairly new field of endeavor, probably only about 20 to 25 years old. And the definition of social entrepreneurship is still being determined. As in any new field, there are debates and arguments about semantics, but suffice it to say, the world of social entrepreneurship is really about supporting practical visionaries, individuals who are developing new solutions to some of society's toughest problems. And it matters most in terms of the narrative and the examples that I can share. So throughout the day, you've heard a little bit about some of the leading social entrepreneurial organizations in our country. Teach for America, City Year, Echoing Green has been at the forefront of providing seed capital to a variety of these social entrepreneurs and others, including groups that you may have heard of like College Summit. J.B. Schramm started this college access program. It was actually named U.S. Social Entrepreneur of the Year at Davos back in January. Or Vikram Akula, who started SKS Microfinance, which is now India's fastest growing microcredit institution, having served over 1 million poor women in India and 20,000 rural villages around that country. Or Raj Vinakoda and Eric Adler, who started the Seed School, which is the nation's first public boarding school. And I could give you many more examples, but I think you get the sense of this particular type of leader. So my exercise, which I found quite fun in preparing my questions, was, does this nascent field, do these type of leaders tell us anything about leadership that might be at all applicable to this conversation on presidential leadership? For the purposes of this exercise, I think yes. And so what do we know about these social entrepreneurs and watching their practical, working out their practical solutions to some of society's toughest problems? So I would say sort of the quintessential quality about the social entrepreneur is her ability to translate passion and aspiration into action. It's about getting to results and impact. And sort of underlying that, that quality about the social entrepreneur, driving towards results, driving towards impact, is, I think, one of the most important qualities that may be translatable to any presidential conversation that we may have. And I think 2 or 3 of my questions actually try to get at that idea of how are you going to get at results? How are you going to bring a contentious debate to a successful conclusion that will move the dial, that will move the needle on a particular policy conversation? So I think that was one of the big frameworks for arriving at my questions. I think the other part of it, and Bill George and others, I think, said it much more eloquently than I ever could, was the notion of authenticity and sort of the deep character of leadership. And sort of what we talk a lot about when selecting Echoing Green Fellows and other social entrepreneurs around funding is the notion of what's in their inner toolkit that is going to allow them to succeed, to drive forward an innovative solution that pushes against the status quo, that critiques and criticizes the status quo, but still gets at results. And sort of the inner fortitude, qualities like resilience, qualities like confidence really matter. And again, I would suppose that they're absolutely translatable to the presidential contest that's underway now. And if you can sort of get to some of those inner qualities, you may get a sense of that leader's ability to navigate difficult terrain. And I think I'll just sort of say a couple of things about sort of a demographic shift that I'm very much working with, the whole notion of this millennial generation. I think most of you know, if you've read Howe and Strauss's book, Millennials Rising, you're looking at a generation from about 1980 to 2000. They call it the Nintendo generation, the digital generation, the Y generation, the boomlet. They're almost demographically as large as the baby boomers. And the way that they're showing up in the world and their expectations of the world as voters, as citizens, I think is going to have a profound effect in terms of a presidential candidate's ability to get them to follow him or her. So just some of the compelling characteristics about this generation that we're seeing very much play out in the applicant pool of Echoing Green are things like the importance of service to one's community. The fact that these young people are so goal and achievement oriented, they're confident, they believe in inclusivity and tolerance, this idea of leaving no one behind. These messages that they were imbued with throughout their upbringing, the way they, again, show up in the world, I think has profound implications for the type of work that they're going to do. And I'll give you one example. Last year, Echoing Green got about 700 applications for 20 slots for its fellowship. We got about 1,500 from 83 countries this past year. There is this hunger amongst young people, amongst this generation, to serve, to be part of the solution and not the problem. And I think the way any presidential candidate responds to them and asks them to join the movement is going to be really important. So I think also some of my questions are about how are these young people going to relate to you as a presidential candidate and as a president, and sort of getting to some of those ideas and qualities I thought was particularly important. So I think I'll stop here.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheryl. So again, you have our questions on the PowerPoint. You'll notice that there are two sets of numbers there. There's the 9 through 17. Those are the questions that correspond to the numbers here, but because of the touchpad technology, you have to vote using the 1 to 9. So choose the questions on the list that you think will be the most provocative, the most gain us the most insight into the leadership, competency, and character of the people. Choose 3 and enter them on the touchpad right now. Again, use the numbers to the left.
3.
So
up to 3.
that obviously isn't clear, so we can't enter double-digit numbers on these touchpads. They don't work. So although Cheryl's questions are numbered, actually numbered next to the question, 9 to 17, you have some big buttons to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Those are the numbers that you have to use. We want to keep a unique number for each question, but we want a touchpad capability here. So choose some 3 questions of this list that are the most important, you think, in terms of creating dialogue about what's in the heart of this person, what's the character of this person, what is the leadership skill set of our candidates. Again, if you enter the 3 numbers, you'll then see a valid sign, and that indicates that your responses have been registered. Okay, we'll take just a moment more. About 150 of you have responded. Let's get a couple more in there. You can change your mind, actually, by clearing. Okay, let's close the poll and see, again, of the questions that Cheryl proposed, which of the ones seem to stand out to us. So it looks like question 10, which you chose as number 2, translating vision into action. It looks like number 13, some examples of where you were a catalyst to bring different groups together. We talked a lot about that this morning. Those are the two that stand out. Excellent. Andy? I don't see any others, but I encourage the scribes to jot down kind of the results, so you'll have the results of these polls, the pulse of this group.
Thank you, Cheryl. Our next panelist is Kevin Scherer. Kevin is the CEO and chairman of Amgen, which is one of the two biggest biotech companies in the world. Amgen's, of course, been a leading change agent in bringing innovative medicines to bear against diseases like cancer. Kevin's been a senior leader there since 1992, and he was appointed president and chief operating officer. He's also had leadership roles at GE and at MCI Communications, and after his graduation from the U.S. Naval Academy on a nuclear submarine as an officer. Kevin's questions in just a moment will be going up on the screen, and in your handout they are on the pink sheet. Kevin Scherer.
Thanks, Andy. I've been to the Kennedy School. It's a nice place, and I'm honored to be here today. I didn't have a chance to attend, but I know the work there is important and widely studied. So I think the things that we do here today will have echoes beyond this room. This is not so easy. When you think about it, somebody comes to you and says, hey, make up 10 questions you want to ask the next president or presidential candidate. You would initially think, hey, that's a pretty easy thing to do. Then if you think a little bit deeper, you have to think about what questions might they actually answer as opposed to just giving you some non-answer. David has lots of experience in talking to these folks. As a CEO of a major company, talking to people, lots of times I get asked questions. Some they kind of pin you down, and a lot you can kind of give another answer. So the difficulty in this particular exercise, I think, is asking questions not themselves that will elucidate in the first response some wow answer, because if with one question we can find some illuminating thing from one of these candidates, they're probably not going to be great negotiators, so you got to worry about that. So what I thought about was what line of questioning would likely start to give an opportunity for the questioner to expose important things that we would care about. Second point, I agree with Andy. Andy has infinite experience in this environment compared to me. I just sort of labor in the world of commerce, and much easier by orders of magnitude than the political world. But the issue that Andy, I think, was trying to touch on that I reflected on was, who is this person? Who are they? Not what's their position on problem X or Y, or how are they going to do task Z, because inevitably in these jobs, people are faced with issues at times and in ways that they nor we can anticipate. So how is this person going to act? That's how are they going to behave as a human being? And my third thought was, nobody's really prepared for this job. Nobody. I, in my very little simple world, was the number 2 person for 7 years, figuring, boy, when I got the job, I'm sure prepared now. And on reflection, I was at best prepared to have a shot at the job, not really prepared for the job. And so you have to think about, how are these people going to get help, and how are they going to learn? So that's kind of where my question set, or at least thoughts, came from. And a couple of them I just comment on, I think. One is self-knowledge. In the past, how have you responded to, evaluated, and learned from mistakes? I worry about people who have low self-knowledge. If they have low self-knowledge, the odds that they can say to themselves, hey, in this circumstance, I maybe need a little bit more help in that other circumstance, and I can't be completely confident that no matter what my initial response is, it's right. How are they going to learn? How have they learned in the past? And the 3 people who are still in contention are from the corporate world. I have enormous respect for senators. I work with them in my job. It's a tough job for sure. But if you compared being a senator to being a CEO or a president, and you looked at it in my world, being a senator would kind of like be a consultant or a board of director member, a really good one. And so they've observed a lot of things. They have opinions on a lot of things. They have prescriptions for a lot of things. They never actually had to make anything happen. So I see my friend Bill George out there in the audience who sure understands this. And so when you're asking somebody who's a consultant and a board member, how are you going to be the CEO, they need to have a healthy appreciation for what they don't know. And I think that self-knowledge is important. And so another one is, what kind of team are you going to put around you? Again, it's a lonely job for sure, but if you've got the wrong team, nobody in the world is good enough to overcome the wrong team. And so how are you going to pick that team? How are you going to evaluate them? How are you going to move when you have to, when inevitably of the 15 or 20 key positions you pick, you're lucky. Jack Welch told me once, if I were 2 out of 3 on picking executives, I'd be the best person in the world. So if you pick 20, for sure, maybe 6 of them are going to be the wrong pick. How are you going to know that? When are you going to react, etc.? And then the other questions you can see relate to this issue of trust, gathering information, and working with the team. So, and then the other one I threw in there that Pat liked a lot, but I left it on. I was going to take it off, but had some resonance is, however much you think these jobs take out of you, you're wrong. It's a lot more than that. And if you can't find a way to relax and recharge and renew yourself in an authentic way, to steal one of Bill's words, you're just going to get burned out in the job. You won't be able to learn. You'll be defensive. You'll go into a spiral and you just won't be effective, and you can't have a bad day. Everybody's looking at you all the time in every single meeting, and if you give cues, whatever your cues are, people are going to get them, and if you're tired and discouraged, you can't hide it. So you got to find a way to be able to renew yourself. So that's a little tour through my ideas.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, so his questions are numbered on your sheet from 18 to 26, but they have an analog on the screen. So take a moment and look at which of those questions you'd like to see posed by the journalists in this room, by the media in this room, by someone not in this room. What do you want to hear the answer to? So take a moment and use your touchpad and indicate your answers. And look for the valid sort of confirmation that your answers. I realize our panel doesn't have touchpads, so probably for Steve Grove, this is really frustrating not to interact with the data as we go along. So take a moment. About half of you have responded. We'll give you a couple more minutes. Excellent. Let's take a moment and see what were the responses. So question 5, again, we hear the power of the word here. Kevin's first question that he spoke about got the highest votes. So question 5, how have you responded to, evaluated, learned from mistakes, and those of your own and those of your team? Looks like an important question for us. Number 1, high-performing team. How will you build a high-performing team? What you will look for in that advisor group. How will you bring debate to the table? Surface conflict, we heard about that this morning. So I see 5, I see number 1, probably the bottom one then. Tell us about a time when your judgment's been tested in crisis. How have you responded? So again, if the scribes can take those down, the facilitators, it'll be another input to your decision making. Excellent.
Thank you, Kevin. Over the past year, YouTube has burst onto the scene as a real change agent in the political domain, impacting high-profile races and bringing previously unheard voices and unseen images directly into presidential candidate debates. As the leader of YouTube's news and political programming and the creator of its CitizenTube political video weblog, we call that a vlog, don't we, Steve?
We do.
Thank you. Steve Grove has been a pivotal player in YouTube's explosive arrival on the scene. We're proud to claim Steve, as you guessed it, one more Kennedy School alum. Steve's questions will be coming up on the screen, and they are also in the yellow sheet of your handout. Steve, tell us about your questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Andy. And it's certainly an honor to be up here on this panel. I was just a student here a couple of years ago, and it's good to feel like I'm back in school with an assignment to bring 9 questions to a panel and grading from the audience. So I hope I get good grades. Actually, it really is an honor to be here, and I don't have a lot of exposure to presidential politics other than through YouTube, which is where I serve as the political director. But it's sort of a misnomer to even really call me a director of anything, because YouTube itself is a platform where citizens now direct how they engage with politicians, how they create political media, and how they influence public decision making. And I think that's what's been so exciting about the internet in general, and I'd argue maybe YouTube is at the forefront of that, changing the way that candidates and voters talk to each other. And so when we think about leadership and politicians and voters and how they interact on the web, I think what the web does is it provides access between voters and candidates directly. You eliminate the media middleman. Voters can ask questions directly to a candidate in a debate or online. Candidates can speak directly to voters with their messages without having to wait for the media cycle to be there to give them a voice. It's also bringing a new level of education to the dialogue here. You have a whole new group of voters out there who are online, interacting with content on the internet, and politics is there now too. And if you haven't noticed, politics is sexy again. I think we're in the middle of really probably the first pop culture election since maybe 1992. Saturday Night Live gets huge ratings when they bring presidential candidates on. Bill Clinton writes an essay for Us Weekly. John Elizabeth Edwards go to People magazine to do their first interview after he dropped out of the race. You're seeing politics become the sexy thing again, and so more people are engaged and getting educated about it without even really trying to. And then I think sort of the third thing that technology is doing for politics and the way that candidates engage the electorate is empowerment, and this idea of empowering the electorate themselves to take action for you and around your candidacy in ways that we really haven't seen before. I think this is exemplified probably most commonly in the Obama campaign, but others have done it as well. And that's what's exciting, I think, about the intersection of politics and technology here. So I will sort of leave the talk about how to make effective decisions or bring a good team together to the other far more able panelists than I, and just talk a little bit about sort of engagement and empowerment amongst the electorate and getting people, maybe particularly young people, engaged in your presidency. So that was actually my first question, was that young people are engaged in this election more than ever before. We see this not only in the numbers of people that show up to vote in the primaries, but also as those who are engaging online and consuming political information. So I think Cheryl brought up the millennial generation, which I'm glad she did. This is a different generation of voters. The millennial generation is a great book that came out recently by this guy named Morley Winegrass. He talked about what defines this millennial generation. He says that we sort of flop back and forth between what he calls Moses generations and Joshua generations. Moses generations are these generations that are sort of like fight the power, don't believe in the system, don't really believe that institutions can make a difference. And then you have these Joshua generations. They're more civic-minded, they're more engaged, they actually believe they can make a difference through things like electoral politics. And the argument this man makes, and I think it's pretty valid, is that we're in the middle of a Joshua generation right now. Young people today do believe they can make a difference through politics, do believe they can engage through the system to make change. And that's a tremendous opportunity for the future president to know that there are people who are buying into the idea that that is a position from which good social change can be made. So one of my questions would just be, how are you going to engage that group of people that is suddenly excited about politics on through your administration? And the president could answer that in any number of ways, but we'll have to answer it, because the thing is, if they decide not to engage through, for example, technology, they're going to be engaged, because people use technology however they want to open up the process and make it more transparent, learn more about their candidates. So that forcing function is sort of here to stay, and how different politicians use it, I think, is going to be very interesting. The second question I asked was about the internet and technology. Essentially, the internet, like I said, has kind of flattened the political playing field. And so you have more of an opportunity, I think, than ever before to have a participatory democracy, to actually learn from the electorate much more easily than in the past. The barrier to entry to get involved in the discussion is so much lower now. You can, for example, post a video to YouTube and immediately get thousands of comments which can inform your knowledge of the electorate. You can empower people to make political commercials for you instead of making your own. And learn about voters' viewpoints in that way. And so I think being able to sort of harness the strength of technology to bring new people in is going to be a key question the next president asks. And there is a sort of balance you find between this new opportunity to harness sort of voter-generated content and voter input in the election and your own executive decision-making. And I think finding that balance is what leaders today need to figure out. The rest of my questions, I think they were essentially about, your own definition of leadership. I think you learn what a leader's like by figuring out what they think leadership is. And so I'd be curious, my questions 4, 5, and 6 for me were, about defining what leadership is, what your purpose is with it, describing experiences that you've had. And this idea, and this is again taking sort of a technology bent to it, but of being a decision maker versus sort of an agent of change. And this has sort of played out to me interestingly about a couple, 3 months ago. We had Rudy Giuliani and John McCain both do a week in the spotlight on YouTube. They made a video, and then people were supposed to respond to that video on the site. And Mary Giuliani's video was essentially, leadership is about me making the right decisions and seeing how many people can agree with that decision and sort of going forward, right? It was about, strong, decisive decision-making, which is important, but it did not resonate at all with the people on YouTube, as you can imagine. You got like 1 star out of 5s, a lot of commentary like, what do you mean? I don't want to be a part of the decision-making. What are you telling me I'm supposed to agree with your decision? And then you had John McCain come on and say, hey, everybody, I'm on the Straight Talk. He's doing it from the back of the bus, Hey, you two, I'm John McCain. I want to hear what Straight Talk you don't think we're doing enough of. What are politicians not addressing enough in today's election? And you got a good response, a lot of video responses, a lot of comments. So I think, the ability to sort of open up and learn from people online is important. It resonates with people. Part of what this quote-unquote millennial generation is about is actually taking action, having the chance to actually do something in politics. I mean, it's not just about responding to or voting. It's actually, creating a piece of content you put online, which is so much easier today than it was before. And I think, engaging those voters to not just sort of follow your lead, but actually create stuff as you go along is really exciting. We saw this most recently with the Obama campaign. They've had a lot of great web videos out there. A lot of people make videos for them. How many people have seen, for example, the Yes We Can video that was made by will.i.am? Or the Vote Different ad of about a year ago, where Hillary Clinton's portrayed as sort of like the big brother, the old Apple commercial. I mean, these were not pieces of media the campaign created. They were created for the campaign by supporters. There's now a whole website called Ubama.com, where people submit their YouTube videos for Obama and they're voted on. So I guess in terms of what I can represent on this panel and bringing to the discussion is just that people do care about politics today. Young people especially want to get involved. It's a tremendous opportunity for leaders to empower and inspire a new generation to get involved in civic action in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. I'm 30, but in my 30 years, I guess, it's a new and exciting time. So I think the next president needs to keep those things in mind.
Great. Take a minute to look at his questions on the yellow sheet. My experience when I talked to Steve on the phone as he was preparing these questions is I love all of these questions. I want all these questions to be asked. So it's going to be hard to choose, I think, among these nominees. So take a moment, indicate with the touchpad, which of these questions do you want posed? Whether that's through YouTube or Jim Lehrer or Fox News or CNN. Okay, let's close the poll, see where the responses are. Okay, so I see that question 1, how do we keep young people engaged? They're engaged, in my lifetime, a lot more elections than yours, is they're engaged like they were back 30, 40 years ago. So how are we going to keep them engaged? The next one looks like that might be the bottom one. In what ways will you help Americans realize the challenges we face, the sobering list that was talked about, the daunting list this morning, and do the hard work of overcoming them together, that notion of how can we get people to weigh in, to make the sacrifices that were talked about this morning, to make the contributions. And then I hear probably, or see probably number 2, how will we balance the need for executive decision making with this need for building consensus, mobilizing public sentiment? So I think those are the questions that we can focus on when we have our discussion. And our last panelist.
Thank you, Steve. Reverend Wilson Goode has been a distinguished leader and public servant for many decades. Serving a range of public and social sector roles. He was, of course, the two-term mayor of Philadelphia, and prior to that was the managing director of the city. He's also been a leader as an Army officer and as a senior Department of Education official in Washington, and of course as a leader from the pulpit as an ordained Baptist minister. Reverend Goode continues to be an active civic leader and is now the director of and prime force behind an acclaimed program that advocates for faith-based mentoring of the children of the incarcerated. His questions will soon be on the screen, and they're on the purple sheet of your handout. Reverend Goode.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here. I treated this as if I was going to interview a candidate. And the first question, it seems to me, that comes off is, why do you want to be president? And that deals with looking at what's in the heart, not what's in the head, not what someone writes down for you to read or to speak on, but what's inside of you, what motivates you, what are your passions, what do you value, and what sort of principles do you really have? And it seems to me that that's the set of questions that deal with trying to get at what motivates this person. And then secondly, it's a whole issue of ethics. There's nothing more important in public life than to have confidence in our public officials. I recall teaching American government for 10 years at Eastern University in Pennsylvania, and I asked my students, when I said politician, what words come to mind? I will not repeat them here, but they were all unflattering. And most of it dealt with the whole issue of ethics. The fact that there was not a sense of a moral compass. There was not a sense of lines that defined right and wrong for those who were in politics, those who were in government. So it seems to me that, that when I pose the question, what do you believe should happen to those close to you when they make a mistake? Try to get at the fact in terms of where's the moral compass on right and wrong in government? And then whether or not this person is willing to be a change agent. Are they going there to be a part of the good old boys network? Are they really going there to really become a change agent? Is there courage there? Is there boldness there? Is there the ability to think outside of the box, to do some things that never been done before, to really to take risks and to take the risk and say, I don't care if I'm not reelected. And when I first ran for office, I said to my staff that we have to govern as if we don't care whether or not we're reelected. And it seems to me that if you can do that, then you can govern and with the boldness that is necessary, and you can become that change agent to bring about basic and fundamental change. And then the final set of questions deals with, do you care? Do they really care? Do they care about the fact that that every single day that 7,000 young people drop out of school? Do they care about the fact that every 26 seconds someone drops out of school? Do they care about the fact that America ranks #1 in incarceration around the world, and number 18th in high school graduation? Do they care about that our cities across America are dotted with homeless people sleeping on the streets? Do they care about the fact that there are just too many children who go to school not able to read and write and enter the 3rd grade, not able to read and write? Do they care about the fact that even with the richest country in the world, that the 80% keep getting worse off in terms of the top 1%? And so it seems to me that we have to begin to pose the question is, do they care? And if so, what do they care about? And it seems to me that those are the things that I would begin to pose to someone who's running for president. And my question may appear to be a little different than others, and it's because of the background which I come from. And this campaign has been lacking, in my view. All of the campaigns have been lacking in the lack of focus on urban issues, on issues that impact upon the poor, upon the homeless, upon those who are in prison, those who are caught up in a cycle of violence throughout our cities. And as we talk about international policies, there's a need for a real domestic policy. And I think that there has not been put forth that domestic policy at this time. And I would just simply close. I've got my signal to close. Just close by really saying is that it seems to me that when you pose these questions in this way, you get at, again, the heart and not the head. Because the brain can direct you based upon what people tell you to do, but the heart is what regulates you and what guides you and what directs you and what helps define who you are. And so I always tell people that no matter what others do, the important thing is that you must be who you are. And so I want to get at who this person really is, because only through defining who this person really is will you know what they will do. And not only that, but what they've done in the past. And what you've done in the past will indicate what you're liable to do in the future. I made my time. Thank you.
I think extending the conversation from this morning, Reverend Goode reminds us that what people care about is equally as important as what they think about. So his questions take us in a different direction, but I think they're equally important to ask.
You have the people?
Yeah, but what percent of Americans are incarcerated?
10%. 10%.
Yeah.
Excellent. Another 10 seconds. Excellent. Let's close the poll. And it looks like what we want to know is what are your 5 core values and how they'll shape how you lead. Question 44. We want to look at how we're going to reverse the numbers between incarceration and high school graduation. And then it's balanced between question 5, question 8. Excellent. In forming this panel and to get the conversation going at the tables, we invited 2 what we call first responders. We heard Rod Kramer's definition of those this morning, to perform resuscitation if we needed. I mightn't have needed it in the last few minutes. So we invited 2 people to comment. Marilyn Carlson Nelson is the chairman of the Carlson Companies in Minneapolis, and among her many awards was also being chosen as one of America's best leaders for 2007. So Marilyn, can you stand, introduce yourself to the group, and pose a question to this panel.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Carlson Nelson. I have good news for Andy Card and the other first responder. My physician husband sitting next to me has pointed out that CPR is a lot easier now than it used to be. You don't have to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. You actually can do just chest compression. So that will be... A couple of comments. As I've sat here, like all of you, and been struck by today's discussions, I kept going back to that saying, it's kind of a threat or a promise, if you will, that a people get the leader they deserve. And so I've asked myself if we should be posing these questions also to ourselves as leaders in this room. Then I do have a couple of other questions. One, I hope that David Gergen will answer a little later, and that is, will the press actually ask these questions, or will they be considered soft and less relevant than some of the questions that are more commonly posed? And the second is to the panel, and that is, do you feel that of the questions that we've addressed, and as we've identified our priorities, that we've actually addressed the one which was tied for third at 60.5% of our interest, which had to do with the ability of this individual to understand and deal effectively with leaders from other cultures, and what kind of experience base would inform those discussions. I'm not certain that we've covered that. Perhaps there's questions you feel would cover that particular issue, and if not, should we add yet another to our roster?
Who would like to comment on the panel about whether or not we understand the mindset of the cultures that we have to deal with to reach a collaborative decision?
Well, I would comment and just indicate that on your, what color is this?
Purple.
On your purple sheet, question 43 asks, what experience have you had that helped you deeply understand the mindset and values of another culture? So I think that gets at the question that you pose. But when you have 9 questions to ask, you can't get at everything. But I think that that I'm satisfied that we've gotten at that question to the other things that we have asked on the panel here.
Anyone else like to comment on how that question should be framed so that we really understand the global mindset, the appreciation of cross-cultural diversity? Andy?
I'd be glad to come at it a little bit more contrarian. The world looks to the United States for leadership. If the United States is not providing leadership, there aren't a lot of people who are ready to step up to meet the responsibility. So I have found with President Reagan, former President Bush, and the current president, and I suspect every president, that the world doesn't really say, we'd like to participate with you in making the decision. They actually say, we would like you to offer some guidance. Maybe they won't call it a decision. And we'll see if the guidance is something that we should follow. And then you invite them to follow that guidance. So I actually think the President of the United States is in a little bit different position than just trying to find a consensus among leaders. I think he actually has to, or she, would have to invite the consensus and then work people toward it. So the President, like it or not, has to be a world leader. When we say the leader of the free world, it's a reality. And so people are crying for direction. And the direction, I think, will come from the United States, whether we like it or not. And if no direction comes, that in itself is direction. And so I actually think the President must lead and invite people to recognize the value of the direction that he or she has suggested, and then try to form the consensus, rather than sit around a table and say, these are the options, what do you want? I think people are waiting for the President to say, this is what I would recommend, and then lead in that direction.
Excellent.
Our second first responder is Bill Pollard. Bill was the very successful CEO chairman of ServiceMaster. Bill.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I've certainly enjoyed this format of asking the questions as if you were interviewing the candidate. And as I was reflecting on what almost every panel member said in one way or the other, was identifying, I think, Andy, you said, what will inform your decisions, and how do you make decisions. Cheryl, I think you said that. Kevin, you got to the question of self-knowledge, and what's your definition of leadership. And Wilson, you said you go to the heart. Really, it gets back, Kevin, to what you said, in my mind, is who in the heck are you? And I used to ask the question when I was interviewing either CEO candidates or senior officers in our company, how do you make the decision of what's right or wrong? How do we get that? What I'd like to give back to the panel, Marilyn, you commented on it briefly, how do we get that question being asked today of our candidates? We focus so much on what they're going to do, but the fact of the matter is they're being elected to a position that things change. Andy, you realize how fast things change after a president gets elected and what they're faced with. How do they exercise the judgment? And then when they make the decisions, how do they understand what they have to build into the decisions to implement them? Because it's not just making the decision. That's probably 10% of the issue. It's building in the implementation to get it done. So maybe the panel can discuss about how we can get that and get the press asking those kinds of questions. Maybe the press asking those kinds of questions. Maybe using technology to allow the citizens who are going to vote to ask those kinds of questions and getting responses. That's my question.
A couple of comments, panelists.
I thought the most insightful question of a presidential candidate was Roger Mudd's question of Ted Kennedy when he was running for president against Jimmy Carter. And it was basically, why do you want to be president? And I do think that is a very relevant question to hear the candidate's answer, except that it is such an easily anticipated question, they all have a contrived response. But that's the real question. And we have to remember that democracy almost never produces perfection. We hope that perfection will be introduced into the policy debate or in our candidates, but the result is the result of a democracy rather than a dictatorship, and a dictatorship can always produce perfection in the eyes of the dictator. But the government that we have is our government, and there will be perfection debated and introduced, and it will vary according to the person who debates it or introduces it. But the result, we hope, is not just good enough. We actually hope it is close to perfection, as close as it can get. But we all should argue about whether or not it is perfection, because that's what makes it dynamic. So I do look to see, as Mayor Wilson Goode says, what's in the heart. I think the toughest decisions end up being decisions that presidents agonize over. And you hope that they are prepared by having done their homework, read the briefing papers, challenged the staff, reached beyond the circle of the people who are on the White House staff to others around the country or around the world. You hope that they will have a historical understanding and appreciation for the kind of decision that they're making, so that they can maybe get a context to other challenges that have been met that were similar. But ultimately, you hope that the president will sleep on it and pray on it and then make a decision. And interestingly, very few times does a president announce a decision to the world. A decision is usually communicated to a chief of staff. And it's The toughest decisions probably are communicated in the morning after the president has woken up and he walks into the Oval Office and he says, I've read the reports, I've called around, I've challenged people, the decision I know has to come, this is the decision. And that's a great burden to put on a chief of staff, because you have to communicate that decision with others on the staff, to a cabinet, or prepare for it to be communicated to the rest of the world, or to a constituency that counts. And so I broke the responsibilities of serving a president into 3 categories, and I plagiarize from Roger B. Porter when I say this. But the first responsibility is the care and feeding of the president, and it gets to what we talked about here. The president has to have time to eat, sleep, and be merry, because you don't want the president to make a hungry, angry, or lonely, or tired decision. And you can never anticipate when the decisions will come. So, you know, the operations of the White House count, because that gives comfort to the president. Then it's policy formulation, but ultimately it comes down to marketing and selling. I got in trouble for saying that with the New York Times, but it's the truth. Because if the president makes a decision and no one knows about it, did the president make a decision? And so the decision has to be communicated, and how you communicate the decision has a great role in how the decision is received, understood, respected, and implemented. And so that's the task of a White House staff, because the White House has no responsibility to implement anything except to make sure the president is well informed when he makes a decision and it's communicated well to the right people at the right time.
Let's go to David Gergen and Kevin Scherer, and then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to come back to Andy and then pose this to Kevin Scherer as well. And that is, Andy, I think you described absolutely the world in which we've been living internationally, and that is so many countries have looked to the United States and say, you take the lead, how would you do it, you could recommend it. But it strikes me we're moving into a new world very rapidly, with power more equally shared. Power has moved. I mean, the big story of our time is power and influence moving to Asia in ways which we might not even have anticipated 10, 15 years ago. And the question becomes, for leadership, how do you adapt to the new changing realities of world power? How should a president respond to these questions? Should we be exercising leadership in a different way? Steve Grove has been describing changes that occur in his part of the world, but one of the big things the next president is going to face is an extraordinarily rapid set of changes in the world itself. And how should the president respond? I'd like to ask Kevin Scherer, as a CEO who is in the international global context and has to respond all the time to enormous changes and challenges that you're facing. How should we pose that to the president? How do we get at this question of adaptive capacity?
Kevin?
Okay, I'll start. If any of you are shareholders in my company, you've probably realized that we've had some things to adapt to in the last year, not all very pleasant. And what I say to the folks is, and we got a company that's based on biology, and so going to biology is a good place to start. And you say the enterprises, whether they be at the state level, the human level, the company level, the biological level, the things that survive over time are not the strongest, they are not the biggest, they are the most adaptive, and they are the most resilient. And to me, adaptive goes to this question of understanding what's going on in the world around you. Are you open for change, or do you have such fixed ideas about the way things ought to be, the way we do business around here? Who's got the job now? I really believe in horses for courses. Some people could be great executives or cabinet members under one circumstance and a complete bloody disaster in another. And when do you realize that things have changed? And to me, decisions, leadership's about decisions and communicating them. And I think as a CEO, as a president, you might be making 5 decisions a year that really, really matter. You might be making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, but 5 of them really matter. And the question I would ask is, how do you know which really matter? Number 2, how do you know what the time constant is under which you had better make the decisions? Because some of them I got to make now, some of them I got to make it over time. 3, what's the process? Who do you listen to? Do you go to sleep and wake up and say, I made the decision, here it is? I don't think you do that. I think that's the end of the process, and who have you listened to? And then finally, do you listen to your gut? That's who are you, the synthesis of all of your experience. As I've gotten longer and longer in this job, my instincts are much more important to me than they would have been in the past. Sure, the data is important, but my instincts, and the instincts are informed by judgment and people around me. So that's all part of the adaptation process. But first thing is you got to realize things are changing and want to act on it.
With regard to David's question about the changing world, the next president will be the first president to face a situation where the U.S. dominance in the world's economy has a different definition to it. And it's because the dollar is not as strong as it used to be, and the strength of the dollar really did offer strength to diplomacy. So I don't think we understand what the role of the dollar will mean for diplomacy, because we were kind of fat and sassy in the past with regard to our own economy. We are still the economy of choice. We are still the place where risk is invited and the consequences are felt, so rather than managed. And so I think we are the most attractive economy in the world because we have the rule of law to back up our economy, whereas China is a very attractive place to invest, but you want to manage your risk in a different way. So inviting leaders to, first of all, step up to the responsibilities that they have is, I think, a task of the president. Inviting a leader of China, a leader of India, a leader of Russia, to step up to responsibilities that they were not used to experiencing, and quite frankly, their political process did not train them to meet. Some were trained to be isolationists, some were trained to be extra or outside of the process. Even though they might have been in the institution, they practiced their diplomacy outside of that institution, in the UN Security Council, for example. But I still think the U.S. leadership is what makes a difference, because there are so many other countries that may not be the dominant economies of the world anymore, but they are very much part of the process that looks to the United States. Italy, Germany, France, Great Britain still look to the United States for leadership. And that doesn't mean that they acquiesce. It just means that they look to the United States for leadership. I think China, India, and Russia are struggling to find their identity in the New World, and that Brent Skolkoff called the New World Order.
So our goal is to get all of you talking now. I mean, I think one of the things we know is that we can all be part of the conversation. That's one of the marvels of today, is we can all weigh in every day on every issue if we choose. And so we're going to try to create that egalitarian access right now to inform us, to inform the journalists that we would like to cover the questions that we generate. So rather than take another question from the audience right now, I'm going to invite you at the table to really become the experts on what is it that we want to hear, the questions that we want posed. You know, we have the Kennedy School behind us. We have a number of journalists in the room. What we hope is that we have the power to get these questions raised. So let me give you the directions for Conversation 4. In the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to ask each table to discuss and come to consensus about your top 15 questions. So there's some game rules here that we're going to put out. You can choose 13, 14, or 15 questions from the list the panelists gave us, because we vetted that list, and we know that list covers many of the aspects of character and competence that we need in this room, in this role. So you can choose 13, 14, or 15, and the debate that we're going to encourage at that table to argue for the questions you think are the most insightful should be spirited. It should be provocative. Then we're going to ask you to add up to 2 questions. So you can raise 2 new questions. Questions that perhaps, as Marilyn said, aren't on the list. Questions that the panel, in making their commentary, have caused you to think about. So you can add up to 2 new questions. So you can have 15 of the old questions from the original panel. You can have 14 plus 1 or 13 plus 2. But we're not taking 15 new questions. We're going to try to kind of consolidate this, continue to funnel it down to a sort of manageable list that we may have a shot of getting asked. We don't want you to wordsmith either. So in the risk of being over-directive here, we don't need your editing. You got a whole bunch of people who can edit. So we don't need your wordsmithing. We just need you to take a question and say, that's the spirit of the question I want in the list, and we'll edit it down later on. There's a scribe at your table. A scribe's job is going to be to text your answers in within the next 55 minutes. So you're going to say, these are the questions we've agreed to. They're also going to text your new questions in if you have new questions. There's also a facilitator, sort of a light-handed facilitator at your table. Their whole point at the table is to just keep the discussion going, to sort of allow people into the conversation, to not let it be dominated by one or more people. So we're going to try to create more of an egalitarian discussion right now, a discussion that allows each of you to have a voice on, I'd like the networks, I'd like PBS, I'd like NPR, I'd like YouTube to pose these questions, and we're going to ask for answers around the leadership attributes, the character, the competence of the people coming. So any questions about what we need you to do, we're going to give you 55 minutes. We're going to come back. You can quick sneak in a break if you want, but we're really going to manage these team discussions right now at the tables, trying to come to consensus about 15 questions. So we want to thank the panel. You've gotten our thinking going. It's been wonderful. And we, of course, invite you to join back to the table. Okay.
Is everybody done?
Well, everybody's probably not done, but we're going to ask the scribes to text in what you have now. So we want the scribes to text in 13, 14, or 15 questions, plus up to 2 new ones. We're going to take about 10 minutes to just talk about this process, and then we'll take a break. Andy?
So again, if everybody could now, if the scribes could text in the results of this discussion now, in the last session we'll be able to present you with results, both as to your choices on the original 45 questions, and we'll give you some information on your new questions. What we're going to do for the next 10 minutes or so is get some input from the groups about anything you want to talk about from your discussions. And let me just, before we do that, make a couple of technical announcements. First of all, at the break, which we'll take at 3:45, let me invite as many of you as would like to respond to the blog that's at the station at the far end. Patrick McKiernan can walk you through what you need to do for that if you haven't done that before. Somebody found a lost organizer. This was in the men's room. If anyone has lost their organizer, please let me know. This might be it. And finally, when we do leave for the break, which will be a 15-minute break, we'll break 3:45 to 4. Please be back at 4 for the student speakers. And if you are one of the 5 designated student speakers, if you could please mic up during the break. Thank you.
Excellent. So we want to take some questions. Your experience of this process, what you came to conclusion about, an opinion. We'd love to hear from the audience to get more participation in general. So any questions from the audience? Comments? Yes. Can we get a mic over there? If you could stand up and introduce yourself.
I'm Patricia Ward-Biederman, and I actually thought this part of the program was over-controlled. I would have liked it to have been more open.
Good. Thank you. We value your feedback.
Sir.
Hi, Andrew Wolk from Root Cause. It's a comment and then a question. I guess the comment is we're speaking at our table as well as also outside with someone about how we might frame. I think there was a question someone said, what are we going to do with these questions? And would it be possible to frame this entire session around what one debate might look like? And could we actually have a debate that was actually about the character and leadership of the president, as opposed to even having one question like this? Could we actually get candidates to have an entire session that just discusses these issues? And I wondered if that would even be possible to frame today as to actually organize it around one debate.
I think that's going to be part of what David's going to talk about in the last session, is what is our call to action from this group. Whether that debate word is used kind of loosely or if it's a set of interview questions, we're not sure yet what form, and we'll seek your input on it. Other comments? Yes.
Hi, I'm Laurie Beth Jones with the Jesus CEO Foundation, and our table came up with a question which was kind of underlying all the questions, and what we would like to ask the candidate is, how do you personally define a successful presidency?
Excellent. Maybe we could have Donna, somebody take that down, like how do we define a successful presidency? What is the criteria for saying I was successful, besides public opinion? What else?
Suzanne Goldstein.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Goldstein, which Andy just said. We had a question that came up at our table, which is that being a president is a full-time job of being reactive to things that are happening in the world. There's so much going on. And yet we've been talking today about what one does in terms of being proactive towards one's own agenda and the things that we want to get accomplished. And the question was, how do you balance being proactive with being reactive?
Anyone like to take a shot at that? Okay, was that one of your questions submitted, Suzanne?
Excellent.
Very good.
What other new questions came up that we could hear a couple of them? Yes.
Tatiana.
My name's Tiziana Deering. I'm with Catholic Charities. The question got to, it was the last one we debated at our table, which got to how the candidates themselves would define leadership and integrity. And it was interesting because we raced through the first 13 or 14 fairly easily and then had a wonderful knockdown about this one. And ultimately we did because we realized we had some very different understandings at the table about what good leadership was. And that if we in a group of sort of this random group had those questions, then we were probably making fairly different assumptions about what we were expecting out of our candidates, and to hear from the candidates themselves what they thought good leadership was probably something we actually didn't know from them at this point, or at least not at the level we should. So that was, without question, the most substantive and rewarding part of our conversation and led to our last new question.
Very good. Thank you, Tiziana.
Other comments? We have one here. No, Joel, she's coming. Introduce yourself.
I'm Jewel Mullen. 2 new questions submitted by our table were, what is your definition of authenticity? And under what circumstances would you use force to implement your decisions?
Force.
Force.
Said forcefully. Harvey?
Yeah. My name is Harvey McKay, and we wanted to know, who would your kitchen cabinet be, and what criteria did you use?
To select them. Any others that we want
Sir.
to add?
Yes. Sir.
Yes, Ken Druck from the Jenna Druck Foundation. We were fascinated with the process of the interview itself, and I think there's a profound respect that the interview itself, we didn't want to waste questions. We realized that many of the questions could be wasted questions because they would get a very political response, and I think that was acknowledged on the panel before. So we talked about the cadence of the questions and questions that could really produce a genuine, authentic response. And one of the ones that we came up with had to do with, it came off of a story by our resident historian at the table who talked about how Lincoln had brought Seward and Chase onto his cabinet. And so the example was to first cite the history and to say, President Lincoln, or when he became president, brought Seward and Chase onto cabinet. Is it possible that you might bring a former adversary onto your team as a teammate, and how would you go about that?
Excellent. Any other comments? Right here.
Mike Jensen from the Harvard Business School. We found the most valuable part of the experience was agreeing on a structure within which to think about it. And Sven Holmes was enormously helpful here. So we thought about it in terms of 4 questions. Who are you? Within which we had to figure out questions. Who is in the room with you, that is, who's on the team, and why? And what process do you use to come to decisions? And then finally, what are you going to do to, how do you actually bring about, how are you going to bring about closure to that process?
Excellent. It's so parallel to what our group discussed. We had 3 of those 4 buckets, and it was the framework that became very interesting. Any other comments here just as we end?
We have one more.
Yeah, hi, my name is Amy Scheckman, and I work in state government. I just had a question, which is, I love the concept of the job interview, but when I do hiring, I never would rely just on the job interview. Reference checks for me are extremely important. And in fact, I spend a lot of time, I don't let HR do the reference checks. I have to do them myself because the nature of what people say. And I don't know what the equivalent is because it certainly isn't endorsements. That's too simple. So I just sort of raised that question of what's the equivalent on the job reference.
Good question, provocative question. One
Yes.
last?
Thank you. Our table came up, Elisa Bass Night, with an additional question that we thought was very important that hasn't yet been asked, and that goes to the issue of commander-in-chief. And we would want to know from both candidates what qualifications and values do you possess to serve as commander-in-chief? And that would apply to, especially to the 2 senators right now that are still running on the Democratic side, and even to Senator McCain, who has clearly served in the country, in our country's armed forces, but yet we still don't know what his value system is in terms of serving, whether, well, I won't go into all the details, but we just need to know more about his value system.
Thank you very much. We should take our break now. All the questions should have been submitted and all of your votes in on the original 44. If we could take a break until 4 o'clock and be back in the room. Thank you.
Questions that each panelist posed. You're going to be able to weigh in and to say, you know, that's an interesting question. I would like someone in the media to be posing that question. I would like to hear the answer to that question, because that would give me tremendous insight into how this person will govern. You'll also get a compilation this afternoon of all of the results of the team discussions that will follow this panel. So after this 1-hour panel, you're going to be spending nearly an hour at your table reaching consensus about the top 15 questions. What is it that we really want to pose to the candidates? And you'll have input from the panelists, you'll have input from the pulse of the room, and you'll have your own creativity and sensitivity to what is it that the public would love to see asked of these candidates. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit more directions about the touchpad technology, but if you can have that handy, that would be helpful. It might also be good for you to dig into the blue packet here. I'm going to use that as a sample, and to find this colorful set of questions. These questions are the questions that the panelists sent us ahead of time. And we've asked them to do a little bit of color commentary on their questions. Why are these the best questions? And you're going to get a chance to weigh in. So you're going to hear our first panelist talk about the questions that are on the first sheet, the bright green sheet. So let me turn to Andy right now, and we'll just jump right into it.
Well, let me thank all the panelists for their hard work in reflecting on their own leadership experiences and in generating these questions. We appreciate it very deeply. We've got 5 panelists here and limited time, so I'm going to ask that everybody limit their comments to 6 to 8 minutes so we can preserve some time for Q&A with the audience. Let's start with Andy Card. Andy is, of course, a distinguished public servant, and we're proud to say a graduate of the Kennedy School. He served for more than 5 years as White House Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. He was the second longest serving Chief of Staff in history. This was obviously a period of great challenge for the United States, with the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happening only 8 months into the new administration. Andy previously served in George Bush 41's administration as Secretary of Transportation, and has also had leadership roles in the private sector in the automobile.
And it may not fit with the overall principle that the president had when he took office. Obviously, there are lots of other tough decisions that a president has to make, including ones that are exclusive to the president. And Article 2 does give exclusive decisions to the president. In fact, the oath of office, which is the real job description for a president, doesn't even mention the issues that we argue about all the time. It doesn't mention taxes or healthcare policy or domestic policy or economic policy. It just says preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And there is no conditional clause to it. It doesn't say if the winds are all blowing in the right direction, or if everyone agrees. It doesn't say if the UN gives you permission. It doesn't even say if the French are on board. You just have to make the tough decision. And it also does not present a timeline under which the decision must be made, except it's kind of like the porridge for the 3 bears. You want it to be just right. And the decision can't come too early, or it may not be the right decision. If it comes too late, it's irrelevant. So you're always hoping that the tough decision comes at the right time and that it is the right decision. And the reason it is the right decision is because you can never make it with an expectation that you're making the wrong decision. You make a decision with an expectation that it is a tough decision, you're making the right one, and you hope that the implementation will be consistent with your expectation. So I would say the courage to be lonely is the most important attribute to have if you're going to be the President of the United States, and every president will have to face lonely, courageous decisions. With regard to the easiest thing to do in the White House is actually to participate in a policy debate, because presidents attract the best and the brightest, and they always should. And a healthy number of them will come from institutions like Harvard and the Kennedy School. But almost every one of them will be a type A personality, and therefore, every time that they show up, they won't even have the courage to admit that they agree with anybody else. So it's not a danger that the president is going to be giving monolithic counsel. The president will always get counsel that represents lots of different views and will be challenged. So I actually think the easiest part of the job is actually the job that centers around the policy debates that you relish so much and look forward to having in your classrooms or in your everyday life. But the president
industry. Andy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Andy. A correction of the record. I did not graduate from the Kennedy School of Government. I actually quit. And that was to help create a climate where George Herbert Walker Bush could end up being vice president and then president. So I love the Kennedy School. I love the way you stimulate theory and invite different practices. And I would like to comment about your theory and the practices if I can. I very much enjoyed the discussions this morning, but I did find them a little bit more theoretical than practical. And I also take a look at the candidates who are accepting the invitation to be President of the United States. And by the way, our Constitution is nothing more than an invitation. We're one of the few democracies in the world that doesn't obligate us to do anything in terms of a relationship with our government. We're just invited to have a relationship with it. It is our government, and we're represented by people who serve in Congress and serve in the Senate. Article 2 says that there will be a president, and Article 3 says there will be justices who put on robes, and we never know their names, and we don't know how they make their decisions. But in terms of celebrating the democracy, we're just invited to show up. And some people accept the invitation, and some people choose not to, but we all talk about it. And the First Amendment to the Constitution gives us the right to gather, to complain, to petition, and maybe make a difference. But it's really Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 that give us the government. And there's no obligation except the invitation to recognize that we can run for office, we can show up and vote, and I wish more of you would accept the invitation to run for office, and I certainly would encourage all of you to accept the invitation to vote. And it's amazing how few people accept either invitation, especially in Massachusetts if you're a Republican. And I am a Republican from Massachusetts, and I did accept the invitation, and it was rejected on more than one occasion. I also find that the candidates who seek office always try to be love-made.
I'm going to ask you to sit here so we have a seat.
Welcome back from lunch. If you could take your seats, we'd love to get started. I'd like to welcome you back from lunch. I'm Pat Zigarmi. I'm a co-founder of the Ken Blanchard companies, and I've been helping with the CPL coordinate this event. I'd also like to introduce Andy Zelleke. Andy is a co-director of the Center for Public Leadership here at Harvard University and a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School. So we're both delighted to have you here. We're really going to start the conversation, get you talking with each other. We've heard the sobering list of challenges, tasks, strategy issues facing this president. We've begun to talk about character. We've begun to talk about competency, talent, skill set we need. We've spilled over into roles of educator, energizer. We've talked about the role of mobilizer, of initiative. We've begun to hint at the power of technology to build consensus. The goal of this conversation is to really say, if we could interview the candidates post the conventions, if we could interview them about what's in their heart, what is their emotional and intellectual intelligence to handle this list of tasks. That's what we're about this afternoon. We're about creating the interview questions. So we've asked 5 accomplished experts to really weigh in. If I could interview about leadership, what would the questions I would pose to these would-be candidates? And we have a diverse audience and therefore a diverse set of questions. And what's going to be fun is you're going to get to weigh in on which of those questions are most interesting, which of those questions are most provocative, Which of those questions will get us insight into the leadership capacity, the character, the courage of the candidates for the President of the United States? After each presentation, you're going to be asked to rate the
magnets. They want you to love them. And so they are with you. They share your pain. They will stay in your living room. They want you to join with them. But my experience is that presidents seldom have the luxury of trying to be, with any success, love magnets. Instead, they have to make very tough decisions. And the tough decisions are usually not the ones we can anticipate. They may center around issues that we anticipate. But the decisions themselves, the tough decisions, are usually subsets of the bigger decisions that we've debated, or in fact, they are decisions that they never thought they would be invited to answer. And so I have found that the greatest attribute that a president needs after having good ethics, and I think something to lean on like faith, they have to demonstrate the courage to be lonely. The courage to understand that they may be making a decision that no one will understand, no one will like, and few will respect. But it's the right decision, and therefore they have to make it. And so when I look for a candidate to lead us, I would say, which one of them has the courage to offend me deeply, to cause me to argue against them, but to do that which they believe is right, knowing that the decisions are always tough. And in fact, if a president is making an easy decision, the chief of staff has not done his or her job, because easy decisions can be made by other people in government. Only the toughest decisions are made by the president, and any tough decision must be a decision where there is some kind of preparation. And time doesn't always allow you to have as much preparation as you would like, because the decisions come very quickly. And it could be on issues that you easily anticipate, like tax policy. The current president took office, he promised to cut everyone's taxes. He was going to cut everyone's taxes. And that was a pretty easy principle to say, we want to cut everybody's taxes. What do the tax cuts look like? Those are the tough decisions, especially when a senator says, I will not sign the conference committee report unless this language is in the bill. That's a tough decision.